Let's talk a little bit about the different types of cameras you'll come across in the world of photojournalism. And we'll also talk a little bit about how you can best adjust them for your needs and things to look out for if you're using them. But to start off with, before we get going on any conversation about equipment, about camera types, about gear, there's one important golden rule to know and to embrace in your heart. And that is, summed up, that the camera does not make the photograph. The photographer makes the photograph. A good photo is made by the photographer, not by the stuff they carry. No amount of money spent on fancy pants stuff is going to compensate for bad fundamentals. You can have the world's most expensive camera with the world's most expensive and fancy lens, using all of the best and most expensive equipment attached to your camera that you can possibly imagine. None of that is going to compensate for you if you don't have good fundamentals. If you're not thinking about lighting, thinking about your positioning, thinking about framing, thinking about your backgrounds, and thinking about your action and blur. None of the equipment is going to matter if you don't have the skills to back it up. So don't get discouraged if you can't afford the world's most expensive camera. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Now, any conversation about cameras and photojournalism has to start with this guy. His name is Mathew Brady. He was around in the mid to late 1800s. Not only was he one of America's first prolific photographers, he was one of the nation's first photojournalists. He bought photo equipment and traveled around to battlefields in the Civil War. He would take pictures of the battlefields before and after. Sometimes they were littered with dead bodies. Sometimes before it would be the faces of the generals as they prepared for things, as they mustered the cannons, as they got their troops ready. He would go out in the field, he would take these pictures, and because there was no way to really print these photographs at the time, he would send the plates, more on that in a second, back to cities like New York, Chicago, Cincinnati, where they would be put in exhibits. He would charge money for people to go and look at them in the exhibits, and then he would use that equipment and that money to buy more plates and equipment. He's taken pictures of pretty much everyone who was famous during this era, everyone from Abraham Lincoln to Ulysses S. Grant to William Tecumseh Sherman. Pretty much every general of the Union side he took portrait photographs of and would sell access to those. There's actually sort of a grim ending to everything. He was expecting the United States government to buy his pictures at the end of the war to document them forever, and then they didn't. And so he was out all of those costs and kind of died bankrupt, but that's sort of a sad story. And his gear was the type of thing that would dominate for nearly 100 years in photography, and it was really just a basic large format exposure system. You would slide a plate in the back of the camera. The picture on the right here is a example of an old style plate, and the plate would have a bunch of chemicals in it that react to light. You would then pull the lens cap off of the camera and hit a shutter, and that would expose light into the camera itself through the glass lens onto the plate where it would be exposed. And after it was exposed, it could then be developed in a wagon. So he would travel around in a photographic van. It was a big wooden wagon with tops and sides buttoned down so it would be nice and dark. So after the battle was over, after he had taken all of his pictures, he would develop them in his traveling van and then send the plates back to, and the photos back to cities to put in exhibits. And ultimately, this style of camera, of put the film in the back, expose it, pull the film back out, didn't really change for a while. Even into the 1930s and 1940s, we were still using this basic setup. Remember Ouija? We talked about him a little bit in the textbook. You wrote, I think, one of your answers on one of the reading wrap-ups about good old Ouija here. He shot on the same style camera that is really just a fancy version of what Mathew Brady was using in the field. It was one of the most famous early journalistic cameras, which was the 4x5 speed graphic. 4x5, and that was the size of the photographic film you would slide in the back. And the instruction manual for the thing was absolutely bonkers. It says that each exposure required the photographer to change the film holder, open the lens shutter, cock the focal plane shutter, remove the dark slide from the inserted film holder, focus the camera, and release the focal plane shutter. It was crazy complicated. It was very, very difficult to use, and there was lots of moving bits and bobs, and it wasn't very fast. You also couldn't rapidly take pictures. You had to do them one at a time. So if something happened in front of you, you had to hope you had everything ready and were really fast at your camera. But ultimately, the fact that it was slow and the fact that it was really complicated wasn't the biggest problem for these big full-body cameras, especially when it comes to photojournalism. No, this is really the big problem. Look at this picture of this full-body speed graphic camera. Now the issue is you can see the lens on the front. This is where the light enters the camera and exposes onto the film. But up here, this is the viewfinder. This is where you put your eyeball in and you look and see what the camera is roughly looking at. And that's the problem. Because the light coming into the viewfinder is completely separate from the light coming into the lens, it's just a rough approximation. It's just a guess. You had to hope that you were focused correctly. You had to hope that you were zoomed enough. You never really knew 100%. And that made for tons of bad photographs, of wasted film and useless time that photographers never quite got back. And so we had to invent something to make it so that the same light was used for both. And that invention changed photography forever. And it was the SLR, the single lens reflex camera. It looks like this. It's probably a camera style you've seen in thrift stores and Goodwills for a while. Your parents or grandparents may have one sitting around. But it was amazing. It completely changed how photography worked, and especially how photojournalism worked. And it did it because it didn't have a separate viewfinder. The viewfinder was integrated into the camera itself. And here's how it did it. Think about this diagram as a slice out of the side of the camera. You're looking into the camera sideways to see how it works. The red line represents the light. So the light enters the lens of the camera, hits a mirror that's perfectly positioned at 45 degrees. The light then passes upwards, hits a mirror, sometimes called a pentaprism, bounces around and goes out the viewfinder. So unlike the full-body cameras, where it was separate light and it was a rough approximation, when you put your eye up to an SLR, what you're looking at is the exact same light that's coming through the lens and is going to expose the film for the picture. You knew exactly how zoomed you needed to be, and you knew exactly if you were in focus or not. And so that made it absolutely amazing. It made it so that you could take multiple pictures confidently without worrying about zoom and without worrying about focus. And for nearly 50 years, the SLR dominated the photojournalism world because of this. But then something happened when we needed to advance, and essentially computers are what happened. So you can see back here, there's this strip that represents the film. Back in the film days, this is where the film would be. Here is your shutter. When you go to take a picture and you hit the button up here, what happens is the mirror folds up on itself and flips up. The shutter opens, and light, instead of bouncing on the mirror, hits the film directly and exposes it. So once computer chips and computer sensors got cheap enough and able to be small enough to put in cameras, what we did effectively is replace the film with a thing called a computer sensor, which is built kind of like film. It just uses code, it uses ones and zeros to represent exposure to light. So instead of using a strip of traditional film, it exposes a little screen built on a computer chip that absorbs color and light. And suddenly, when we start doing that, we add a letter. And instead of an SLR, we get a DSLR, a digital single lens reflex. Digital because it is running off of a computer chip now, instead of running off of film. And single lens reflex is because it is using one single lens. It is using one reflection of light the whole way through the camera. So this is part one, looking at where we've come from. The next thing we're going to talk about in part two is the technical aspect. What are the different numbers and different terminologies used in DSLR photography? So go check out that video now.